Hey friends, welcome to Bokeh, a podcast exploring the ever-blurring lines between the personal and business lives of professional photographers. This is your host, Nathan Holritz, and I'm happy that you can join me today in connecting with photographers and entrepreneurs as we discuss photography, business, and, oh yeah, that sometimes messy thing that we call life. This podcast is brought to you by Photographers Edit, custom image editing for the wedding and portrait photographer. Just visit photographersedit.com. All right, Bokeh Podcast listeners, thanks so much for joining us for yet another episode. I'm here with a new friend of mine, Kerry Murray. Thank you so much, Kerry, for making time for the Bokeh Podcast.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here.
And we're going to dive into an interesting conversation as we get into the podcast today about getting started in the wedding photography business. This is not something that we've spent a lot of time on, and I'm interested in getting into this just because it's a relevant topic, even for those who've been in the industry for a while, to hear the perspective of a newer photographer. But I'm also interested just because you seem like quite the fascinating personality, Kerry. And I don't normally do this, but you've got a pretty great bio or intro on your website. So I'm just going to read this before we get into everything. It says, I grew up in New Zealand and spent many years in sunny Australia before moving to the UK and meeting my wife. I've now lived in the UK for over 13 years, currently in the fantastic city of Bristol with my wife and 2-year-old daughter in our little Victorian terrace house. I'm 30-something, late 30s, if you must know, and enjoy keeping fit, eating healthy, and hang on, who am I kidding? I try to keep fit and to make the very occasional attempt to eat healthy. I run as much as I can, not very far and not often enough. Love good food and drink and adore travel, especially with my family. I'm already interested. My attention is captured. Tell us a little bit more about your family just to get us started.
Sure. So, I have a really small family. It's just me, my wife, and my 2-year-old daughter. We're together pretty much all the time. And it's being a new dad. I still consider myself a new dad 2.5 years down the track.
Sure.
It's just a constant learning process, right? I mean, you've got your own children. Yeah, it's been pretty much a whirlwind for the last. I think we're starting to set there's some kind of semblance of, structure and normality. I'm sure that'll be short-lived, but yeah, I mean, it's great,
Well, what I do remember about the 2-year-old milestone, if you will, especially with my son, when Austin was born, actually, I was only 22 at the time. And needless to say, I not only lacked perspective just about life in general, but I also lacked a significant amount of patience. And so when he got to about the 2-year-old mark, and it was even, I guess it started before that, he began to not only have conversation, but even in kind of on an adult level, his understanding about how to interact and even empathize with an adult was surprising at that age. But that I say milestone because that began a time in his life where I could actually engage with him. Whereas before it was like this, screaming, crying, and you're kind of at a loss as to how to handle a situation. Now you could actually have a conversation that was at least somewhat logical. Have you found that with your daughter?
Oh, definitely. I think now is kind of maybe even, dare I say it, the best time that we've had so far in her life, because she is so interactive and she's fully forming sentences and really conversing with us on a pretty advanced level. And so we can kind of understand each other. And I think it's really relevant what you say about the empathy. I can really see her forming this sort of emotional maturity as she grows, and she's kind of trying to figure out what these emotions are that she's getting hit with all the time. So that's a really interesting process to watch, but it's also a big responsibility to try and help her kind of navigate all of those new things that she's encountering. So it's great, and it's great to be able to help her, but it also is kind of a reminder of, for me, the kind of the growth that I want to go through and the things that I want to be doing. And, my wife and I will often say to each other, we should be more like Edith, our daughter. We should be more like Edie, just in terms of her ability to empathize and her kind of kindness and generosity of spirit, which is something that we both strive for.
And I have a lot of respect for that because it was something I was actually going to touch on. One of the biggest lessons that I've learned as a parent, my kids are now 16 and 13, and I'm continuing to learn and reminded of the significance of kind of setting ego aside and being willing to open to them and to learn from them, even from a 2-year-old. It really is fascinating how much you can learn, if nothing else, just in kind of the mirroring process. You see them mirror your behavior, and you're reminded that maybe you need to tone down the anger in response to their behavior, or that to be more empathetic, as you were talking about. to even just to be a little bit more interested and excited about the little things in life. And it's just it's been a wonderful and certainly a very humbling process for me, but a very educational one. I've learned a lot from my kids, and I love that you and your wife have already kind of prioritized that and that you discuss that amongst yourselves. I think that's beautiful.
We do. Yeah. I mean, it does mean that we often need to kind of keep ourselves in check as well, right? Because as an adult, you get a lot of bad habits. And so,
yeah,
it's like this mirroring that you mentioned, we've got this mirror held up to us all the time, and it's just exposing all these bad habits that we have that we want to work on. So I guess you could see that as a good thing as well.
It is a good thing. I may have mentioned this before in the podcast, but a number of years ago, and again, I spoke to my immaturity. This was certainly a stage at which I was still, I guess, relatively young and learning, immature certainly, but I just honestly, I struggled with my temper. And I could certainly point to where some of that came from. But regardless, I was, through that process, at least transparent with my kids. My son in particular, I think at the time was maybe 6 or 7. And I got upset one day in response to something that I think he did, or maybe Addison did. And I came back to them or to him and said, hey, look, you know what? I'm sorry. I lost my temper. I shouldn't raise my voice at you, just having a rough day, but that's certainly not an excuse. And I apologize. And I did this 2 or 3 times. And then one day I got upset and he said, Dad, are you having a bad day? And so he was already seeing the pattern of Dad has a bad day. And then he gets upset a little bit more easily. And I'd like to think that I've addressed that tendency, a sense. This has been about 10 years ago. But to your point again, that the significance of mirroring, being reminded of our behavior and the fact that somebody's watching, and more importantly, our child is watching and they're actually learning from us. It really is. It's a humbling process, but it's an absolutely enlightening process and a beautiful one at that. So I appreciate your transparency and sharing a little bit about that. And really, this is a very relevant question. We normally start the podcast with something that we call our technique for time. And we talk a little bit about how you spend your free time. I know a lot of that centers around your family, but talk to us a little bit about, amidst having a full-time job, also starting a photography business, how do you create time for yourself, for your family? Is there a particular workflow tip that you might be able to share with us?
You know what? I wish there was. And I if there's anyone out there who's got that, then please let me know, because I'm still trying to get there. I think for me, though, what I try and do is I try and kind of mentally schedule blocks of purpose to my time. So whether that's family time, or whether that's exercise time or work time or just me time, I try and kind of block that out of my mind as to when that might be every day. So for me, I think if I'm going to do something that's super important, super work based, I kind of mentally, my go-to is the morning time. That's when I want to do that, and it doesn't matter what that is. So that could be comprise a number of different tasks, and the tasks are kind of irrelevant. It's more about the block of time that needs to be dedicated to that specific thing. So if I'm having family time, that is kind of blocked out, and that's family time, and that has a start and a finish, and it doesn't matter when or what we're doing during that time. It's just a case that I've kind of mentally put that aside, and that really helps kind of keep me on track, but it helps me focus on the thing that I'm doing at the time. And it helps me kind of, I suppose, make that time a little bit more valuable if you can kind of imagine that, in terms of work time, if I can just block that out and I can focus on what I need to focus on without too many distractions, then I find that time can be a lot more productive. And in fact, sometimes you can fit a lot more into that time than you might normally otherwise do if you're trying to, do 1,001 different things and balance family with home, with errands, with other stuff at the same time.
Yeah, it's very, very true. And I love that this has been a theme on the podcast for some time now, the significance of blocking time, setting it aside, being very intentional in the use of that time. And then ultimately what you're speaking to, the significance of presence. And man, it's a good reminder for me, even as much as I talk about this and emphasize this and encourage photographers to live in the moment. It's something that I still need to be reminded of as well. And you really can, I think there is something to being able to actually truly focus on what you're doing in the moment. This is not just for the sake of work, but also for, as you pointed out, family, for your kids, your significant other. Our kids, I think in particular, speaking of the fact that we can learn from them, they can see when we are truly present with them and when we're not. And they may not say anything about it, but they're very intuitive and they can read us. And even if it's a slight glance at the phone or the tendency to say kind of versus actually engaging in a response to them that is somewhat intellectual in nature. A tendency to get lazy in conversation. They can pick up on those things. If we're not present, it's easy to go that direction. And so I love that you are intentional in the use of your time and really giving focus to that.
Well, I try, but what I have to point out is it doesn't always work that way. So, that's the attempt, and I think it's probably an ongoing thing that's just going to be a challenge, forever, really, because we can't kind of turn off the demand for our time and our attention. So, if I'm playing with my daughter and my phone goes off, then I'm kind of torn between, shall I just have a look and see what that thing is? Or shall I just continue being focused in this moment with my family? And that's sometimes tough, and it's really easy to get kind of very relaxed about it to the point where you're mixing everything at once. And, it's funny you mentioned that kids are attuned to it. My daughter does pick up on it. She knows when I'm on my phone. She knows if I'm not paying attention, and she will make efforts very actively to gain my attention. And it's that point I know that I can, I need to switch on. I need to dial into that.
Yeah, and this is such a great reminder. Again, I appreciate you kind of sharing and again, your vulnerability and openness and sharing your personal experience with us in that effort to block off time, to create time, not only for work, but then also for family. My assumption based on what you're saying so far is that a lot of that so-called free time is spent with family. What do you all like to do together? How do you spend time together?
My daughter's of an age where she just loves parks. Any kind of park, if it has swings and slides, she is into it. So we spend a lot of time just going around. They have a ton of great parks in the city that we live in. So we can kind of go around and check out all of those. And she has some of her favorites. So we spend a lot of time going to the parks. But we love nature, really. We love going out into the countryside and, going on walks or going to the seaside. And we love hanging out on the beach. So, there's a ton of stuff that we love to do, particularly based around kind of travel and getting away and getting out of the city and generally just kind of spending that quality time together.
Yeah, it's incredible just to get out. This past weekend actually had the opportunity to rent a motorcycle, go with my girlfriend and some other friends and get away kind of into the mountains of Tennessee for a little bit. And at one point in time, we parked the bikes and went hiking. And there is just something about getting away from city life or even small town life, just getting out in nature, walking alongside a creek, hearing the birds, even the sound of your feet as you're stepping on that dirt and moving through the trees. You hear the wind blowing through the trees. It's such a beautiful experience, and you get to be in touch with life in just a different way. And I think it's a good mental break for us, especially as creatives too, kind of clearing our head and giving ourselves space to be creative again.
Yeah, it's terrific. And, that's something that we'll kind of do pretty much most weekends and some of the weekdays recently as well. We've had some great weather in the UK these last kind of maybe 3 or 4 weeks, and we've just been taking full advantage of it. So that's what we like to do. And besides that, I think travel is a big thing for us. Getting sort of out and further afield is something that my wife and I loved to do before we had children. And now that we've got our little one, I think she's just kind of somehow, I don't know, we've kind of passed this genetically onto her, but she's always asking when we're going on our next holiday.
I love it. I love that you're kind of building that habit in her too, because there is something to be said for travel, especially when it comes to developing our children's perspective and really all of our perspective for that matter. It's something that I've made a habit of, particularly in the last few years with my kids, taking them on at least one big adventure every year where we go somewhere that they haven't been before. They have a new experience and hopefully gain a little bit of perspective. And that's really, really powerful. Tell us something totally random, maybe that most people wouldn't know about you.
So most people besides my closest friends won't know that I used to be a professional DJ.
Really?
Yeah, it was one of my first jobs, and it was kind of my big ambition at the time. And this is the kind of the mid sort of 90s when I was doing this. And so I was a professional club DJ for a while.
And is that something that you miss? I mean, do you miss that scene and that energy?
Yeah, a little bit. So I was around that scene for a long time, and it's something that I don't know if I miss it as such, because I'm old enough now to kind of, I spent my time and I did my thing. Yeah. But yeah, it was a great time in my life, and the whole kind of club scene and just being around people. Really, there's a few similarities. I'm not going to say many, but there's a few similarities to the kind of photography work that I like to do, which is really to be engaged with people in moments. And I think it's sort of similar in the kind of DJing world, because you're constantly trying to either create a moment or be in a moment with a group of people. And so there's some similarity there for me.
And I was actually kind of curious about that. What would you say is the biggest takeaway, or maybe even a couple of takeaways from that experience, whether it's how you now interact with people, you kind of alluded to that, or some other aspect of that experience that you're able to apply to life or business now?
I think it's about engaging. So, it's real easy as either a DJ or a photographer to kind of just observe and to observe very quietly and from a distance. And I suppose for me, what I like just as a kind of personality is to engage with other people and to learn about other people and to kind of converse and sort of, participate with others in a group environment. So whether that's DJing or photography, I think the biggest thing for me has been to kind of create they're almost micro relationships in a way.
Yeah.
These kind of very short little connections that you can make with people in a very quick space of time.
That's really interesting. Honestly, that has been a weakness of mine. I've never, for the most part anyway, I should say, I've become more comfortable with it, I guess, as of late. But for the longest time, I had a hard experience with going to even like a party scene, or something. You go to a photography event and maybe there's 100 people in a room and then there's loud music playing. And the notion of small talk to me was just not something that I really got. I wasn't very good at. I have a tendency of wanting to go deep in conversation. This kind of one-on-one conversation like you and I are having right now is something I really enjoy. But of course we can do that because we can actually hear each other. So I'm kind of curious in that club scene, what enabled you to be able to engage with somebody, like you're saying, that kind of micro interaction or micro relationship in a way that was engaging?
Well, I think it's less your traditional kind of engagement that you might think of when we think of things like networking events, because of course, as a in a club environment, as a DJ, you're separated by virtue of kind of proximity, but also because of the thing that you're doing, you're not really an active participant, but you can be in a way because essentially what you're doing is you're doing everything through music. So it might be that you're playing a record that somebody knows or that a group of people are really familiar with, and they will then engage with you because of that, and you can kind of have this sort of mini, I won't say relationship because that's probably too great a word for it, but you can have this interaction that's kind of through the music, but it's kind of personal as well because it's almost a secret. If you can have a sly look with somebody or a kind of knowing glance, and that can tell you a lot. And so these kind of things, even on a kind of tiny scale, help create that personal connection, I think.
So we're going to actually dive into this in more detail here in just a bit, kind of get into the background of your photography business, but then also what you're going through now as a relatively new photographer trying to build your business up. But for those who may not even have time to listen to the complete episode today, I want to give them something to walk away with. And I'm curious what one of the toughest lessons is that you've learned so far as a business owner.
Sure. So I think the big lesson really for me is that this is definitely going to be hard work, and it's probably going to be harder work than any of the other jobs that I've ever had. And I think that's because, you need to put a lot of yourself into it. There's no one waiting, to give you a paycheck at the end of the month. This is really about putting everything that you can, both from a skill perspective, from a time perspective, and also I think a little bit from an emotional perspective as well, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So I think that's the big kind of, I don't know if it's a lesson yet, but it's definitely a realization that this is going to be something that's going to require a lot of sustained energy to make work.
And so I'd naturally go at this point to a thought, which is that, in our culture these days, whether it's American culture or British culture or otherwise, I think there's a tendency toward, well, I'll speak for American culture anyway, there's a tendency toward wanting to go, not necessarily the easy way, but at least the more comfortable way. And when up front, as you're just now building your photography business and you see a road ahead of you that may not be the easiest, what is the motivation that enables you to kind of trump that feeling, to overcome that for the sake of kind of some long-term goal? What is that you're reaching toward?
So that's a terrific question. I think for me, it's really about, I suppose, being the master of my own time to some extent and my own kind of career. So, the easy option would be to not kind of embark on this sort of journey and to remain in a kind of corporate job, and that's relatively stable, and I have a whole kind of almost 20 years worth of experience in that. But for me to live the kind of lifestyle that I want, I know that that's not going to come from a 9 to 5 in an office.
Yeah.
I know that that needs to happen some other way, and I need to be able to kind of work in a way which allows me to have the kind of quality home life that I want. And so that's really my motivation, is to be able to kind of decide, is this the day I'm going to do a huge edit job, or is this the day that I'm going to go and, check out a wedding fair, or is this the day that I'm going to go and spend with my family? And that's something that I really want the flexibility to be able to do. So, for me, that's kind of a key motivating factor. And also I think there's something about the kind of construct of working in a sort of office environment, 9 to 5, that is somehow, and it's kind of a weird thing to say because I've spent, a huge chunk of my life doing that, but it's almost incompatible with how I want to live as a human being.
Yes.
So for me, it's about, creating the kind of life that I really desire.
Yeah, I love that you make this point about the construct. This is something that has been, I think that the idea itself has been even more significant to me, even in just the less than a week. I spoke about the weekend trip that I had just a few days ago, and the freedom that I experienced in that, of course, getting to do something that I enjoy, and riding a motorcycle and spending time with one of my favorite people, my girlfriend, and good friends as well. It was a wonderful experience and a reminder of what I want out of life. And you look around at the world, and whether it's corporate life or, I kind of woke up this morning to some news about Facebook stock dropping 20%. And I only bring this up because it was just mind blowing to me. You're talking about the construct, but I'll read this. I think this may have been a New York Times article, or maybe on Bloomberg, I'm not sure, but they said that the revenue increased 42% to $13.2 billion, missing the $13.3 billion Wall Street consensus. And this is why the Facebook stock dropped 20%. Like, this is what the world is making a big deal about. And I'm just like, it's a game. It is a construct. And for me, I want to step away from that mindset, maybe even that approach to business. And I have a kind of what I refer to as a big picture view, the things that I'm reaching toward, that I'm looking to live out for the sake of, my own emotional health, but also for the sake of my family. And it doesn't involve that construct. And so I love that you're very clear about what you're working toward, and that ultimate goal is bigger than the temporary uncomfort, which is this process of starting a business. And we're going to delve into what that looks like for you here in just a little bit. But talk to us a little bit about your photography business and kind of the brand position that you've established thus far. What sets you apart from your local competition?
Sure. So I think this is still, because I'm so early on in this process, in this journey, this is still very much a kind of work in progress. But I think for me, I call myself a wedding photojournalist. I think that kind of really adequately describes the sort of approach that I take, which is really about, taking, natural, unstaged, kind of authentic photographs of couples to really demonstrate their story. And that could be via, engagement shoots, couple shoots, family shoots, or wedding shoots. And, for me, it's really about telling that story in a really authentic way, which, I hope will be the thing that distinguishes me from my competitors. But, I suppose when I'm thinking about my competitors, actually, there's some great photographers out there, right? So am I going to be the best photographer out of this huge group of really talented individuals? Well, I'm probably not. So that's not necessarily something that I'm trying to achieve. What I am trying to achieve is I'm trying to achieve a level of consistency and a kind of, I suppose, a style which really speaks to what I'm trying to show, and hopefully speaks to the couples that I'm working with, but also to others as well.
And do you find that in your local market in particular, that storytelling approach to wedding photography is something that's not as common? I certainly experienced that early on in my wedding photography career in the small Chattanooga, Tennessee market where I live. It was relatively easy to set ourselves apart by offering what we were calling at the time a contemporary style of wedding photography, but it was much more journalistic in nature and a lot more use of black and white imagery, for example. Do you find that you have a great opportunity to kind of distinguish yourself because that's not so commonplace in your market?
Yeah, I think so. I think probably much like some of the markets that you've been exposed to as well there in the States, there is a lot of the very traditional, very kind of, posed, very beautiful wedding photographers out there.
Sure.
And styles. But I think it's becoming more popular, especially now with the kind of, the invention of, things like Instagram, where, candid shots are much more popular, and very, very high quality candids that you would get from a professional are, becoming more popular. And that style generally is becoming something that I think people want to see more of. So yeah, there's definitely a mix at the moment, certainly within my local market, between the kind of very, very traditional and so more kind of documentary styles.
Yeah, that's interesting. You speak to the significance of candid imagery that comes from professionals, and what comes to mind when you say that is the intuition that a photographer develops as they photograph more and more. They know how to look for those kind of the in-between moments, to borrow a cliche phrase, but that split-second expression that comes across a bride's face when she glances at her new husband, or maybe the father of the bride, the way that he's looking at the bride as they're having their first dance, whatever it might be. But those little split-second moments, you develop the ability to be able to capture those things, and it's reality. And I think people more and more appreciate reality. You talk about Instagram; they appreciate the experience of being able to see who that person is behind the perfectly posed image. And we as professional photographers have the opportunity to be able to give that to them. So that's really powerful.
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things that I would say to my couples is that I kind of want to show them all those moments of the day that they missed out on.
Yeah.
Because, when you're getting married, that is a whirlwind thing, and it is over really quick, even though it can be a very long day. Your recollection is sometimes a little bit hazy because you're trying to speak to, sometimes 100 or 150 different people, and, make connections with them and try and enjoy yourself as well. And so there's lots of stuff that you might miss out on. And it's those sort of small moments and those little interactions, those glances and those looks that are really the thing that I kind of focus on and want to bring out.
Oh yeah. It's so much fun to capture that kind of thing. I still, one of my favorite things was photographing an engagement session where I had the opportunity to be able to get that kind of really raw emotional interaction between the couple. It's such a beautiful thing. And I think we have a wonderful privilege and opportunity as photographers to be able to share that, certainly with our clients, but the world at large. It's a wonderful, wonderful privilege. I'm curious, as you're developing your photography business, what is the thing that you enjoy most when it comes to gear? I mean, do you have a particular camera that you're using that you just love, or maybe a lens or an accessory or of some kind? What's your favorite?
Yeah, so I'm shooting Nikon, and I shoot with a D750, which I find just fantastic. I have no complaints about that camera at all. And I suppose in terms of lenses, I'm a big fan of portrait lenses, and kind of 85, the 85 1.4 is just such a fantastic piece of glass and super versatile, super quick as well. So, you can deal with some great low light situations with that. But I think for me, just the kind of look that you get from that and the rendering that you get is fantastic. So I think if I was to choose my favorite just small pieces of kit, then that would be it. I could probably shoot a whole wedding with an 85. It would be tough at times, but I think that would just be perfect.
Oh, I hear a wonderful challenge ahead of you to do just that. I think that would be really incredible. But that lens too, one of the wonderful things about it, aside from the beautiful imagery that you can capture from it, is that it's relatively inexpensive too. And for a photographer who is just getting started, maybe doesn't even want to invest or have the money to invest very much in equipment, you can get just stunning imagery from this lens, which at least in US dollars, I think is around the $450 mark.
Yeah, I think it's slightly more expensive here in the UK, but for sure, I think in terms of affordability, it's really up there. And for me, it's about making the most of the kind of equipment that you can get, right? So I'm not going to have 10 different lenses because, frankly, I'm not at the point where I can do that. So for me, it's about knowing what I can get out of the stuff that I have.
I love it. Well, I want to get back to our earlier conversation. We were talking about the struggles of getting started in photography, or more specifically, wedding photography. And leading up to our conversation, you were really upfront with me about how real that struggle is. And you specified a number of things that are challenges for you. One of the things was young family commitments. You alluded to your young family earlier, and I think it's a beautiful thing that you're putting so much priority on family. But of course, the reality of having family and then trying to start a business at the same time can be quite a struggle. Work, you still have a full-time job, a corporate job, mortgage, trying to figure out how to pay the bills ultimately, and then getting booked, getting new business, getting clients. And so I thought it would make sense then for us to just kind of break each of those down today. And I'd love to hear from you about your experience with each, that the challenge innate to each of those, but then also what you're learning about how to overcome those challenges. So if you don't mind, maybe we can just start, we can go back to family and talk about this notion of young family commitments and how that relates to starting your photography business.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think, like I said before, everything is a balancing act, and it's actually even worse than that. It's a juggling act.
Yeah.
And so it is trying to dedicate those sections and those blocks of time in the right way. And definitely trying to get a business off the ground is a huge, huge challenge for me. I think even without the challenge of trying to do that, it can be difficult at times to balance work and home life. But I think what I try and be aware of is dead time. So what I mean by that is time where I'm not doing anything, but I'm not doing anything because I just need to relax. I'm not doing anything because I'm just being lazy, or just where I have time and it's just not being used very productively. So sometimes you just need to sit on the sofa, right? But for me, this kind of concept of dead time where I could be doing something productive is where I need to fill that, because that's the time that I have available to me. That's going to be the thing that is going to help me get this business off the ground. So I need to be, that's when I need to be approaching suppliers, approaching venues, trying to converse and talk to inquiries coming in and generate new inquiries as well. So, for me, this concept of sort of dead time, and it might be, in the evening, when dinner's done and my daughter's in bed and everything's quiet, and I have maybe an hour or two where I could just hang out and not do very much, or I could be investing that time, and that's the time. I think for me, that's what I have available, so I need to use that.
This is really interesting to me. And first of all, I think the thing that comes to mind is, how do you, if you've got a full-time job, you've got family to allocate time to, how do you balance the utilization of that so-called dead time for the sake of your business with also making sure that you don't get burnt out? This kind of ties into my questions too about how you manage a full-time job, but have you found a good, I love that the distinction you made between balance and really juggling being a more accurate word, but have you found a good way to kind of juggle that and make sure that you don't burn yourself out in the process?
Yeah, I don't know if it's that I've found a good way to do it, but I think my natural tendency is that I'm a sofa guy, right? So I love to be on the sofa and I love to watch TV. So that's kind of my happy place.
Yeah.
So I don't have a problem with doing that, but I'm also super aware of stuff that is going to burn me out. So I'm kind of hyper aware of, if I'm working late on some business stuff, I know when my time's becoming really counterproductive. So my productivity just goes through the floor in the evening. Past about 9 o'clock at night, I'm not really any good. So I know that by 9 o'clock I need to have done what I want to do. So that's kind of my cutoff, really, is that I need, a little bit of downtime in the night. So in the evenings, I'll have maybe an hour or two where I can just chill out, relax, kind of get my thoughts together for what's going to happen the next day. Yeah. But I know if I need to do something, I can kind of sort of be very aware of that threshold. So I tend not to be a burnout guy. I'm not the guy that, does the sort of 6 a.m. and then finishes at midnight every day for 2 weeks and then crashes out. Yeah. I'm a little bit more naturally, I wouldn't say lazy, but I'm naturally more relaxed in that regard. So I think burnout for me is less likely, but what is more likely because of that is that I'm not investing enough of the time that I need to invest in the things that I want to achieve.
Well, I don't think that we evolved to be human beings who are working 6 a.m. to midnight. And I would like to think that that's the anomaly. I wouldn't call you lazy for not wanting to live that lifestyle. But I'm curious, when you talk about finding that dead time, how many hours would you say that you're able to pull from your week amidst work and family to be able to allocate to your business, just on average, if you would take a guess?
Sure. So on average, what I'm trying to do is dedicate about 10 hours a week. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to figure out whether that is enough or whether I need more. So at the moment, it's around about 10 hours a week.
And then within that, you talked earlier about the way that you're spending that time, whether it's reaching out to vendors or connecting with venues. What percentage of your time, if you don't mind breaking that down,
Sure.
What percentage of those 10 hours are you allocating to those various activities?
So I would say that 50% of that is kind of what I would call research, which sometimes drifts into not very productive time. Because research can just be consumption, right?
Correct. Yeah.
I might just find myself for an hour just checking out someone's Instagram feed,
right?
And that's not productive time. So, within that kind of research bracket, I need to make sure that I'm doing the things that qualify as being research based and making that time productive. So I think 50% of it is probably research based, because for me, it's about finding the right suppliers, connecting with other wedding photographers in the local community, or connecting with other suppliers. And then the other 50% is, things like managing social feeds, replying to inquiries, chasing up leads, that kind of stuff.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned research, because that's actually, I have Saturdays for me, or my kind of allocated day for research. But I love the fact that you point out that unless we're specific with that notion of research, it is easy to get carried away. And that really plays on a theme that we certainly have emphasized here on the Bokeh Podcast, which is the importance of being intentional. We even talked about it earlier, knowing exactly what it is that we're working for and letting those goals drive what we do on a day-to-day basis. I think that's so important. But let's jump from family then to work, managing, kind of balancing your time with family, with work. You've talked about how you spend, and I love that you have a very specific number in mind, those 10 hours a week, but you're talking about 10 hours in addition to, whatever it might be, 30, 40 hours at a full-time job. And I'm curious how you're balancing the energy and the mental resources for your corporate job versus that with your photography business.
Yeah, that's very tough. That's very, very tough. And I think, the one thing to be aware of for me that's been key is that, because I'm trying to do two things at once. I'm trying to start a business as well as, support and do a good job in my regular life. I need to be able to make sure that my time isn't being split or cut up to such an extent that I'm sacrificing one over the other. So that's really key for me, because my full-time job is the thing that keeps the lights on, right? And I need the lights on. So I need to make sure I'm doing a good job. So what I do is, I'll sometimes trade off an hour here or there if I need to respond to something during my working day. I've been very fortunate over the last few weeks. I've had a kind of break in between work, so I've been able to kind of invest a lot of that time back into my photography business. But on the whole, I think, it is a struggle. It is difficult. What I tend to do is I'll take breaks throughout my working day. So with my 9 to 5, if it's lunchtime, over my lunch break, I might respond to some stuff for my photography business, or I might post some things. Actually, scheduling is a really key thing for me as well. So I've been using, I'm sure you're familiar with Hootsuite.
Yeah, for sure.
Other scheduling applications are available, but I've been using that a little bit, and that's really helped me to manage my social presence and my social posts, because what it does is, it's taking away that onus on me to be constantly thinking about what the next thing is going to be. So I can do that a week in advance. I can let that run. I can kind of monitor and respond to comments or likes or whatever it is, but I don't have to think about that on an ongoing basis. So it's kind of something that's sort of, taken care of and automated as best it can be.
Yeah, I love that. And we actually talked about this yesterday on a Workflow Wednesday episode for the Bokeh Podcast, but the significance of planning social media all in a span of time, an allocated, again, segment of time in a day. Haley, who heads up our digital marketing and runs social media for us, I think Thursdays are her days where she plans out the next week. And the great thing about doing that very thing is that now you don't have to be distracted every single day thinking, I've got to get another post or 2 or 3 posts up. And planning, the copy for that, and finding just the perfect image and processing that and prepping it for posting to social media. If you have set aside a segment of time to do that very thing, you can schedule that out using something like Hootsuite or Buffer or otherwise. And then you can just kind of set it and forget it almost, which is a beautiful thing. I'm so curious, though, what do you actually do, if you don't mind sharing, for your full-time job? And does that have any kind of tie to wedding photography?
Nothing.
Okay.
So it is completely unrelated. My full-time job, I work in the property industry. And within that, I kind of work in and around systems and data. So, that sort of comprises what I do. Almost IT related.
IT, okay. Well, yeah. This is really a great segue, though, into, you mentioned mortgage specifically, but we'll just talk about paying bills and ultimately making a living. I mean, what does this conversation look like in your head about making the transition from working the full-time job, being in the corporate world, and trying to figure out what the next step is or steps are in order to get to the place where you're making a living through your photography and you can make that transition to doing photography full-time?
Yeah. So that has been that's the single biggest thing that has been difficult to kind of break down and start to unpack, because there's so many moving things within that. And I think one of the big things as well is that, I've had almost a lifetime's worth of career doing something which is not the thing that I'm now striving towards. And so what that means is that, I've been very fortunate to be relatively successful in the work that I've done. And so you kind of get to a point where to make your side hustle, my photography business, the thing which takes over from that, becomes more and more difficult, because your earning potential needs to be so much higher than perhaps it would have been 10 or 15 years ago. So, with that, the responsibilities, of course, of mortgage and family and all of that stuff that comes with it, you need to be able to meet those. And so it kind of makes the transition, I think, a little bit more difficult. So for me, it's been about saying, okay, well, how would this transition work besides just, money? What does it mean to me to be able to make that transition, and what would the kind of minimum look like that I would need to be bringing in to be able to make that a reality? And so, I've been able to break that down, and I think that's really been the starting point for me to say, okay, well, what's the goal look like to be able to make that transition?
Yeah, and it's a very logical and pragmatic way to go about it. There's been a lot of conversation in the industry about pricing. How do we price ourselves? And photographers, a lot of times as they're getting started, are just kind of, they may be looking at competition, or even just kind of making a stab in the dark, kind of guessing at what their starting price should be for a portrait session or for a wedding or for wedding photography services. And the reality is, it really should start at a very practical and pragmatic place, which is, how much money do I need to make in order to, first of all, pay the bills, and then secondly, be able to put some money away in the bank or in investments or otherwise, and then maybe put some additional money away for the occasional vacation or two each year. And so now that you have those numbers, you're able to actually have, again, a very specific goal to work toward. And that should enable you to, first of all, decide a business model, which then, of course, drives the target client and ultimately the price that you're charging that particular client in order to make those financial goals. Does that relate in any way to the kind of conversations that you're having with yourself in regards to this? Totally,
yeah. I mean, absolutely. So what you've just touched on there is kind of exactly the kind of the discussion that I've been having with myself, which is around how much do I want to be working? So do I want to be doing 50 weddings a year and then spend the rest of my time, editing photographs, or sending those out to photographers edit. But do I want to be investing that kind of time in that? Because actually what that takes me back to is some of the problems with the 9 to 5, which is that you're always working. So actually, trying to balance in that pillar of, I suppose, of what I want to achieve, which is having more time with family, I need to be able to say, okay, well, in order to price correctly, I need to be doing less wedding work. So I need to be shooting less, but I need to be charging more. And finding that balance is very difficult, especially as a new photographer, because you're not established. You don't have the portfolio. You're not getting those word of mouth referrals because you haven't, shot that many weddings. So
right.
For me, it's trying to figure out where that sweet spot is to break into the market. I know there's been a lot of discussion in the industry, and I've listened to a lot of podcasts and spoken to a lot of colleagues about it as well, which is, should you do work for free? Should you heavily discount? How do you price yourself? And I think it's the challenge for everybody. I think everyone's just trying to figure it out, even established photographers.
It's true. Yeah. And I think one of the things that enables the right move into those various markets, whether it's kind of the mid-level or moving up into the high end, is not only awareness of the market at large, but even more specifically the local market. And then connections are really significant. You spoke to an effort at connecting with vendors earlier, and that really, really is important too, especially if you're moving into that mid to high-end market. Referrals are a significant source of business at that point. And if you're not connected to the right people, it's going to be tough to get business. I would say that particularly in the high end, that is true. And when I say high end, I know in the U.S. market about 75 to 80% of weddings are photographed for $2,000 and less. And then the next 10% or so are in that 2 to 4 range. And then in the 7% or so, I'm leaving a couple percentage points out there, but is in the top, so above the $4,000 range. And so if you're going for that, you or any other photographer is reaching toward that segment of the market. Of course, the reality is that you know that you're competing with a number of other photographers for a very, very small segment of the market, and it's a little bit tougher to get into it. And one of the things that I've said actually to photographers here in the U.S. market is, while high-end wedding photography is certainly appealing, and of course a lot of the desire to be involved in that segment of the market has to do with working less, there is a flip side, which is that 75 to 80% of the market is on the low end, and there is an opportunity, and I'm just going to plant a seed here for you, Kerry, but there is an opportunity too to come up with a system that would enable not necessarily you to photograph, but maybe a team of photographers to photograph, 200, 300, 400 weddings a year, and to be able to actually go after what is the larger and in some ways the more lucrative segment of the market. So these are all things to be considering, and not, again, just specifically for yourself, but for photographers in general. Is there, considering their business model, how much money they need to make based on their personal goals and business goals, what segment of the market do they go after? It's a tough conversation, but it ultimately is driven by goals. And I love that that's where you're starting, and you're letting that drive your decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think for me, because I'm still working a full-time job, I do have the flexibility of being able to decide on a very bespoke and case-by-case basis what I'm going to charge.
Yeah.
And so while I may have a kind of starting price, that starting price may rise or it may drop depending upon, my relationship, the way I'm feeling about a given client and the way that I see this panning out. Is there another kind of non-monetary benefit that can be gained from doing this work? That's a consideration as well. And what is that worth, and how can I bake that into a package? So for me at the moment, I'm able to kind of be pretty creative with the way that I price.
That's great. But ultimately, of course, you've got to book clients, you got to get new clients, new business. And so that brings me to my last question, which is how you're going about actually doing just that. I'm curious what this process has looked like for you, maybe what's worked, what hasn't. If you can share that with our listeners, that'd be great.
Sure. So this is without a doubt the biggest challenge, is trying to get inquiries and get clients through the door to be able to book them. So for me, there's a ton of different ways that a lot of photographers are doing it. Some have told me that Facebook is the best thing that they have ever used, and it's kind of generating a ton of inquiries for them, and they're booking loads through that. Instagram is another. So, all the kind of social channels, website inquiries, going to wedding fairs. These are the kind of things that obviously are out there, but where do you spend that time? So for me, the question has been, what am I going to do within that, and how should I do it? So far, most of my inquiries have come from Facebook and Instagram, aside from people that I've known. So trying to leverage my existing network as well is a huge thing. So, we talk about word of mouth. Well, actually, I kind of already know some people, so I need to put it out there, and trying to, you just never know who's going to be getting married or who knows somebody that could do a referral for you, even without portfolio. So that's been the kind of thing that has led to a couple of bookings for me. Aside from that, though, I think there's going to come a time pretty soon where I'm going to need to be thinking about, what does my marketing strategy look like, and is that my own kind of social marketing, or is that paid marketing? And is it the case that I'm going to need to go to wedding fairs and try and set up stalls and stuff? Which for me, that's probably not the kind of area that I like, or that I'm comfortable in that environment. But it's an open question really for me.
So it's started largely though with connections, and have those connections been just in person? I mean, relationships with close family and friends that have led to opportunities to photograph, or are you finding those connections through a social network, or maybe a combination of the above?
colleagues. So colleagues is a great kind of resource really to use because people kind of know you, and usually people are really happy to send your details across to people that they may know who are getting married. So that has been kind of the big key for me. Equally, I suppose it's a little guerrilla warfare. So this is kind of a bit left of field here. But one thing that has led to booking for me, for one booking in particular, is going along to wedding fairs as a observer and not having your stall or anything like that, and kind of approaching people who you can see are looking for photographers. And that has been something that has led to booking for me. And actually, I feel relatively comfortable in that, even though it's slightly outside of the norm and may not be something that, certainly not the guys that would be setting up their stalls at the wedding fairs would want to be happening. But, for me, that's kind of been fine. And like I say, it's a little bit left of field. Why not, right?
I'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, you mentioned Facebook ads, connections, referrals through connections in one form or another obviously play a big role in getting a business started. But Facebook ads are a really wonderful opportunity, at least at the moment, for getting new business. And I'm curious if that's something that you've explored at all, or if it's something that you're just considering for the future. What does that look like for you?
Yeah, so Facebook ads is definitely something that I have considered. I've run a couple on very, very low budget, which hasn't led to very much. I've spoken to some other photographers in the industry who have invested some significant money in doing that. That has led to huge numbers of inquiries coming through and significant uplift in bookings. So I think there's definitely value in it. I think it just depends on how much you want to invest in that as a platform.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard pretty incredible numbers. In fact, we had Easton Reynolds back on episode 135. For those of you listening in, if you didn't get to listen to that episode with Easton, make sure that you do, and it'll kind of give you at least a bit of an idea of what it looks like to run a Facebook ad and how you might go about that process. But Easton has had the opportunity to consult with various photographers in the industry, and he's talking about photographers spending just $100 on an ad spend and getting back thousands in revenue as a result. So right now the ROI is pretty great. Those price points are going to go up pretty significantly as more and more people begin to take advantage of that platform. But it's certainly a wonderful opportunity. There's a lot to learn. It's a big topic. And my suggestion would be for our listeners to go check out episode 135 of the Bokeh Podcast with Easton Reynolds. That'll kind of give you an intro, and then you can link to some of the resources that we reference in that episode as well. But yeah, interesting conversation. We've certainly, even at Photographer's Edit, seen some pretty great success using the platform. And I think we're maybe, and I wouldn't say necessarily the early stages of the benefits of that platform at this point, but there's still wonderful opportunity out there, and it's a great opportunity to book new business, especially for new photographers. Well, what I'd like to do here, just in closing, and I really appreciate you making time for the Bokeh Podcast today, Kerry. Would you mind sharing with our listeners where they can find you online, your website, social media, so they can kind of not only follow your brand and your work now, but see where you go from here?
Sure. I'd be happy to. So it's pretty much the same on all my social channels, but Instagram is Kerry Murray Photography. Facebook is / Kerry Murray Photo, and the web is www.kerrymurrayphoto.com.
Perfect. Well, we'll make sure to link to those in the show notes, as well as any of the other resources that we've alluded to. But I really appreciate your openness, your willingness to share with the Bokeh Podcast, your learning experience, and I'm sure that'll benefit our listeners as well. Thank you so much for chiming in today.
Well, you are so welcome. It's been my pleasure.
Thanks so much for listening to the Bokeh Podcast today. Will you let us know what you think by leaving a review of the podcast in iTunes or maybe in the Apple Podcast app? And I'd love to hear from you personally with your thoughts about the podcast, maybe suggestions about future topics and guests for the show. My direct email is nathan@photographersedit.com. The Bokeh Podcast is brought to you by Photographer's Edit, custom image editing for the wedding and portrait photographer. Just visit photographersedit.com.